Hello everyone, and welcome to the 28th video in the TypeScript Game Engine tutorial series. This video is going to be quite a lot different from most of the other videos in this series, in that it's going to be a post-mortem of the project so far. It's going to be sort of an overview of things that we've done in the engine, things that we've picked up on the game, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and just sort of taking a look at some of the things that maybe we could improve on to make our life a lot better using this engine. Some of the things we might want to add or tweak, for example. And so I figure before we move on, this would be a good exercise to sort of go through. So basically I have this listed out in positives and negatives. So first off, it's very flexible. The engine is very flexible due to the object component behavior structure. There's a lot of ways that we could just easily sort of append functionality to things simply by tacking on a component or tacking on a behavior. That system seems to be working really well. Adding features can be done in a decoupled, contained way. So we can add features to the engine very easily by simply adding a behavior or a component, or sometimes maybe just a class, but we've done things in a structured way where there aren't a lot of whole cross-cutting concerns outside of some of the game-specific items such as the player controller. Also, what's worked is it supports auto-resizing in multiple browsers, including mobile. So one thing that I'd like to point out is if we actually open up the dev tools here in Chrome and we turn on this device toolbar, you'll note here that we have the ability to sort of emulate some devices. Now this emulation isn't perfect, but I could emulate an iPad, for example, which has a different aspect ratio than a Pixel 2 XL. And you'll note that the game scales well and works in all these different devices. So I can still play this game just as I would on the desktop, but in a mobile device. So it works on mobile. Let me just close that out for now. The next thing is we have underlying support for 3D. Due to the way that we've actually created things, all of our positions, or I should say, not only positions, but our transforms are all three-dimensionals. Our shader supports 3 dimensions. Even though it's largely unused at this point, we wrote the engine with it in mind to support 3D so that we can actually extend to 3D in the future. So that is going to be huge when we actually start implementing 3D stuff. So now onto the negatives, and I realize there's probably some other positives that I could go into, but I really want to use this as more of a critical look at what we've done so far, so that we can improve the engine and make it more usable and more user-friendly and easier to create games with. So some of the negatives. The zone files are very, very verbose. Just for this very simple game, there's all this logic, or not logic. There's all this this data in here. This game actually has 1,100 lines of configuration for the data objects that are necessary. And this is something that we probably need to look into optimizing. And there's a couple ways that we could potentially do this. And I don't really want to go into depth here because I haven't really completely thought all of them through. But one thing is we could change the format of the file so that it's not as verbose. We could use something that's maybe closer to an INI file, or something maybe that gets compiled that's much shorter. There's a lot of different options that we have. JSON might be a little bit too verbose for what we want. It's certainly not as bad as XML, but it still might not be ideal. So we need to look at file formats, as well as how the actual zones are constructed within that. The next thing is there's no way to inherit configurations of objects or components or behaviors. There's no way to sort of set up a pre-configured object, for example, and be able to use that multiple times. So the best example of this actually is the duck, right? So we have our duck that's used in game, but further down the file we have, let me find it, our title duck, right? So the configuration between this duck and the other duck further up is basically the same, except for the name and the position. But yet we've had to define all this stuff multiple times. Also, the behaviors here are a little bit different. So it would be nice to have a way to say, hey, we want to use this pre-configured object, and then just override specific properties. So some sort of system in place to be able to handle that would be really nice. So that's definitely a drawback. So the stand-up of components and behaviors involves a lot of boilerplate logic. And what I mean by that is, like, if we look, and I even sort of mentioned this a few times, that we have to create this data class, which has all this stuff in here to extract the properties from JSON, and optionally throw errors in some cases, convert its types, maybe set from JSON. And then we also have a builder, and then we also have the actual behavior itself. And the behaviors themselves, for the most part, aren't that complicated. But if you look at this scroll behavior, for example, close to a half of the file is just boilerplate code. And so it would be nice to have a way to not have to have all this logic in here for every single behavior and component that we have in the system. It would be nice if we had some way to sort of trim that down. Maybe this is this builder is more responsible for feeding properties to the behavior it creates. I don't know. But this just feels like a lot of boilerplate that is sort of redundant that we could get rid of. Again, I don't necessarily know how I'm going to handle that just yet, but I wanted to sort of bring it up. Okay, so the collision system is axis aligned and only it's axis aligned only and far from robust. It also only supports 2D. To be completely honest, the collision system that's in place now is probably going to wind up being removed, unless we create another 2D game. The collision system here was designed to be simple, to sort of illustrate how a basic collision system might work, but it was never really designed to do anything robust. So we could never create a fully three-dimensional game using that system because it simply wouldn't scale well. There are lots of things that would need to be done to optimize that system, such as only checking objects within a certain range of it, objects that it could feasibly collide with, and also it's fairly limited. So it's axis aligned only, so it doesn't take rotations or scale into mind at all. It only handles very, very basic 2D collision. So I'm thinking that will probably receive a complete overhaul at some point, and it's likely going to be a brand new system. So just be on the lookout for that. I'm definitely going to have to do some thinking about that. If any of you guys have any suggestions about any of these, by the way, feel free to let me know. But the one thing that I do not want to do is use some pre-existing library. Whatever solution we decide that we're going to roll with, we're going to implement it from scratch, just like we've done for every other aspect of this engine. Moving on. So there is lots of uncommented code that needs to be cleaned up and commented. So for expediency, I have sort of stopped commenting all the code, just because it's not entertaining to have a video on YouTube watching somebody write comments. So one thing I'm going to be doing very shortly is I'm actually going to be doing a comment and cleanup pass across this entire code base, so that it sort of is brought back up to the standards that I like to adhere to. Now, there are lots of theories and different opinions on commented code versus uncommented code, and which is better for what reasons, as well as what the definition of clean is. And I actually am going to make a separate video about that, because that's actually a pretty contentious topic, and lots of people tend to have lots of different opinions, and of course I have opinions on it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with them, but when you're writing code, you should write code the way that you think code should be written. Obviously, if you're working in an enterprise level solution, you'll have to adhere to their standards and whatnot. But anyway, I don't want to get into that now. I am going to make a separate video about that coming up at some point in the future. So the next thing is kind of something that's actually been bothering me for a while, and I think I've voiced it a couple of times throughout this series, but the current solution is extremely reliant on using Visual Studio. So we have this whole structure with the project and the solution, and the Visual Studio actually uses IIS Express to run this under the hood, and I've had lots of problems with this. So like one thing that I run into a lot of times is, like, if I'm in here and I have the debug window open and I come back to Visual Studio and I hit the stop button, it doesn't always, okay, it did that time. It doesn't always actually kill both processes. Sometimes what will happen is when I actually hit the stop button with the debug window open, it won't actually close the browser. It'll close the debug window like that. So this is an example of what I'm talking about, right? So it should have closed this process, but it didn't. And the problem with this is, if I were to go and run this again now, it opens it up in a new tab, and then Visual Studio can't correctly connect to that new instance to debug it. So this is sort of an ongoing frustrating. Yeah, see, so it throws an error. So this is sort of a really frustrating thing. It makes iteration very difficult, and it just gets in the way a lot. So I want to move away from using Visual Studio, and I want to use something that's a lot more flexible. What I use particularly at work right now is VS Code, which is a sort of lightweight version of Visual Studio, but it's a completely separate tool. It's not even it's not the same as Visual Studio at all. And I went into this tool's use a little bit in the Linux video in this series, but I actually want to switch to that completely and get away from full-blown Visual Studio, because it's just too big and heavy, and it's not flexible. And I want to switch to using Node and NPM, as well as HTTP server as a web server, because it's very quick to iterate and build and test your changes without having to close the browser every single time. And there's just a lot more flexible workflow that can be done there. So workflow is something that is extremely important in development. It can either make you or break you in terms of time spent, because the more time that you can spend developing and not worrying about having to do repetitive processes or wait on tasks every time you go to run your project, the better. So I definitely want to switch that up. And yeah, as I brought up, the IIS Express can be very buggy, and so that is a huge reason to want to get away from that. Okay, so this is another one that's sort of been grating on my nerves for a while, and the the basic of it is the game and the engine logic are located in the same space. They should be separate projects and repos packaged using the npm. And I'll go into packaging at some other point, but basically, one of the things that I had mentioned a couple of times in here is that we have behaviors, for example, that are very specific to the game. So like this Stupid Duck game has this player behavior. This player behavior is extremely specific to this game. It has no place in the engine. It does not belong in the engine. But there is no separate game place for me to put it in. So that is where it lives right now. So at some point, I will be splitting that out and actually creating this kind of stuff. Excuse me. This kind of stuff will be created in the game where it belongs, and the engine level components, such as let's say the mouse click behavior, for example, that belongs in the engine because that's something that can be used from game to game. The bitmap text component is something that can be used from game to game. That's not game specific. And so the ability to separate those two will be very valuable in the future because we can minimize at some point the updates to our engine when we're just writing game-specific code. Alright, so those are the major points of the Post-Mortem that I sort of wanted to touch on for now. One more thing that I want to touch on in this video before we go, and I'm not going to go into detail on any of this stuff, but I sort of started putting together a list of some future projects that we might do, and none of this stuff is set in stone. But I'm thinking maybe maybe something like a vehicle combat game might be fun, like an old Twisted Metal sort of a clone type of thing, or a networked RPG. And both of those would be 3D projects. I'm thinking I might also do maybe like a 2D RPG, just to sort of get our feet wet with some more of these things, or maybe I'll make like a 2.5D RPG. I haven't really decided, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to plan the next project and at least kind of pick a direction that I want to go as far as that goes. If any of you have things that you would like to see as far as game projects that we develop using this engine, definitely feel free to recommend them, because maybe it's better than one of the ideas that I came up with, and maybe it'll be something that we wind up rolling with. So I just kind of threw down some ideas here. I also have a list of items to do. So asset loader error handling, that is something that is not handled at all right now. If an asset fails to load, basically we don't do anything about it. We don't throw an error. We don't check for it, and so that's something that we need to log and make it very explicit as to what happened and why that asset failed to load. We also need to develop a UI system with some controls. So we need a concept of game screens, the ability to flip back and forth between one screen and the other. Our Stupid Duck game did not have this, and so as a result, it wound up in this very complex architecture of relying on the player behavior and the zone being configured a very specific way in order to get objects to hide and show at the appropriate time. So having a robust UI system that we could switch screens on and off would make that a lot easier and a lot more robust and easier to config. So that's something that we definitely need to set up. And some of the controls that will go with that would be like just a basic panel, so just a blank panel. That maybe it's scrollable, or maybe we have like a separate scroll container type object. A label, a button, an image box, checkbox, radio button. Also, the ability to have windows and dialogues, and maybe have those be resizable, would be nice as well. Multi-page bitmap fonts would be nice, so that we could have some fonts that are either richer in their definition, or their image, or much larger in the terms of the characters that they support. Configurable audio would be a huge one. So in the engine right now, audio is loaded this way, which is terrible. This should be loaded through some sort of configuration file, and then the audio manager should basically look at that configuration file and stand that stuff up. Same goes with materials, bitmap fonts, all that. The next thing that we might have a use for, I'm not 100% sold on this, but state machines, and I'm not really going to go into what those are now. That's going to be sort of a topic all of its own, but they can be something that is extremely useful if used correctly and in the correct scenarios in not just games, but really lots of software projects. We also want some support for system fonts, so that is basically taking a font off the computer, like Arial or something like that, and not relying on a bitmap font, but using perhaps under the hood maybe the 2D Canvas API to render that to a texture and then blit that texture to the screen anytime it's updated. So that would give us a little bit more flexibility in terms of fonts. I'm not 100% sure I want to do that because making that performant can be kind of a challenge, and for what reward, I'm not really sure. So that is sort of a maybe. I'll put a question mark there. Advanced audio. So right now our audio is very simple. It's two-dimensional. It's just play a sound. That's all we can do. We can play or pause or stop a sound. That's it. And what we need is eventually is like three-dimensional audio. And what that means is as you're walking by, say, a campfire, you can hear the audio pan from one speaker to the other as if you're walking by it. And also, the ability to crossfade and things like that. So we want to have a advanced audio engine at some point that can support that type of thing. Configurable materials I already mentioned. We also, move engine to its own library separate from games. So yeah, that's still to do. Networking. We don't have any networking support at all, and so it might be nice to include a server implementation to go along with that with our client. I don't know what that would be written in yet. It really depends on the needs of whatever it is that we're writing. Technically, it should be able to interact with any form of server, and what is traded back and forth should be irrelevant to the networking system. The game itself should have some awareness of what to do with that data back and forth to and from the server. All the networking system should be really responsible for is saying, hey, here's an address, send some data to it, and tell me what the result is, and that's it. So that is definitely something that we want to look into. 3D. So definitely want to get full-blown 3D support, 3D meshes, animations, all that. We want, at a minimum, we want lighting. Normal maps would be nice. Specular maps definitely would be a requirement because that just helps things look a lot nicer. I'd like to get normal maps in there too, but it's not really a huge issue, at least in the beginning. Physics, 3D physics, that's kind of a big one. And again, it depends on what kind of game we make as far as what we implement there, but that's kind of a big one. Object mesh loading, obviously, animation system, that's pretty obvious. So the next thing would be to implement a render buffer / post effects system so we could have full screen blurs, fades, various effects applied after the game has actually been rendered to a texture. The next thing is potentially looking at WebGL 2 support, which incidentally supports render buffers out the box. There are some issues with using render buffers in WebGL 1, and so if we decide to cut over to WebGL 2, it's something that's pretty new and not widely supported on a lot of browsers and devices yet, so we may look at that. That's kind of the reason it's towards the bottom of the list. The next thing is input handler overhaul. We want to make the input handler a lot more robust. So being able to query things like the keyboard state, the mouse state, things like that, and be able to capture the mouse device and handle tap versus click and drag events and all that kind of stuff. So an input handler overhaul is going to be definitely necessary at some point. And then, as I mentioned before, a zone overhaul, which is basically the way that zones, more so the configuration for zones, are handled, and potentially change to a better format, whatever that may be. And so these are some of the items to do that I've sort of come up with so far. It is not an exhaustive list, but it is merely a list of things that I wanted to get down so that I have sort of a direction of things to keep in mind as this series continues. So as you can see, there is a lot more to come in this series, and I look forward to sharing it with you guys. If you guys think of anything else that you would like to see added or addressed in this game engine, please feel free to leave some feedback in the comments below. I would love to hear what some of your thoughts and opinions are on this Post-Mortem, as well as the direction that the engine is going. So with that, I don't want to sort of drag this video out any longer. I want to keep this one kind of short. So thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next video. And if you guys haven't already, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.